It was dangerous. You know, back in those days, they'd bring in the goons, he would call them, to bust up strikes. My father was involved at that time early on in International Harvester. He led the first wildcat strike out of International Harvester. He was very much involved. And the consequences behind that was, you got to understand, there was racism going on then, as you see racism manifesting itself even now. But back in those days, it was very direct. So it was physical, it was threatening, not to mention just the union aspect of it. It was very dangerous at that time. So there were consequences. And of course, at some point, it got to the point where it went through the McCarthy era in the 50s. And during that particular time, what they would do is they would accuse you of being a communist or something and call you before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Carl and Ann Braden, who's allowed it now, went through that process as well. And what they would do is they get you come in there and say, oh, no, communist, what are you talking about? And if you said, no, I wasn't in a meeting so-and-so, they'd get somebody come in and lie, and next thing you knew, you was 5 years in prison. Mm-hmm. So, you know, in that situation, my father, who by that time had risen to be the one of 400 union representatives of the Machinist Union, because he had risen in the ranks and gone to another level. He suffered the consequences of that particular piece. He didn't go to prison or anything, and he didn't testify either, and of course that was against one of the union things. You know, one of the exceptions back in those days in terms of unions was the UAW and the UE. I had to make that because I remember that historically, his telling us about that. So there were consequences because those people like Carl and Ann Braden and those people who asserted themselves in that day, they were targeted for those purposes to try to weaken or discredit them. And then they were involved in other things too. For instance, there was Andrew Wade, for instance, who purchased land in Shively at that time, which was all white. There was this racism piece going on, of course. And my father was very much involved in that piece, even to the point where the police wouldn't even defend them to go to live in the house. Well, back in those days, you know, they were very direct, so, you know, they just put their own little group together with their own little shotguns, and they went out there and did it themselves and defended it. So back in those days, it was a little more direct. I see some aspects of it historically evolving different places, but it was a very dangerous time, and we had a sense of that, but they shielded us from the danger. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if there was a strike before school, I can remember sitting in a car yards away from a strike, out of the way of harm, observing the strike, because they were educating us as we went along. So when the strike was over and driven, I thought back home, was driven straight to school. So we didn't miss anything with respect to that. That would be 6 a.m. in the morning sometime, you know. So they involved us.
And let you see.
They involved us in the processes.